Okay.
And I quote, her deepening despair found expressions in the names she gave her children. One of them was Owumbiko, that I implore you. But that took no notice. Owumbiko died in his 15th month. The next child was a girl, Ozomina. May it not happen again. She died in her 11th month, and two others after her. Ekwefi then became defiant and called her next child Onwuma. Death may please herself, and it did. Unquote. This passage from Things Fall Apart that I cite above testified to the spiritual significance of names in the fictional land of Umuofia, the setting of Chinua Achebe's classic novel. It also shows the importance of names and the belief in the ability of names to ward off evil. The spirit of Ogbanje refused to be appeased by these names. But then the dialogic nature of the names becomes very important. In a way, the mother, the family, they are conversing with death, pleading with death through the naming of the child. So Muhoja's chapter shows another dimension to the ability of names to serve spiritual functions. The child survived. In our chapter, she mentions that, and she talks about one particular, family where the children survived only when the name of the grandmother line was given to the child. The introduction of gender dimensions introduced power dynamics to the issue of naming. This is significant that even at the community level, the question of power becomes evident, and there is a clear winner since the child survived when given the name from the grandmother's family. So this chapter shows the cultural and spiritual importance of names and its place in African cosmology. Another significant fact in this chapter is the power of the grandmother in the naming process and the consequences on the child if she refuses to give the child a name. The act of giving a name to the child by the grandmother can legitimize or delegitimize the child, and this has serious implications. It can lead to the child losing the right to inheritance, etc. I find this very important because it makes a big statement on the power of women in certain African societies before contact with Europe. So there is always this impression that, African, women, they don't have any role. They're always at the receiving end. And there's so many chapters in this book, actually, that talks about the importance of women, their function, and then, of course, their agency in the naming process and in their society. Colonial masters changed African names as a way of dehumanizing them. Yes, they know that the changing of a name also has cultural and spiritual significance. Significant examples abound in the Bible. Abraham became Abraham for obvious reasons. Jacob became Israel after wrestling with an angel. And the changes to these names have serious spiritual implications. So this book shows in different chapters how the colonizers use different flimsy excuses to cancel African names. But African names became the first casualties of colonization and missionary assaults. In different chapters, the book shows that names were derided and assaulted and consigned to the dustbin of history. So again, just in a way, as a way of colonizing Africa. So for me, the greatest impact of this book is the realization that name is more than a label. The way different chapters pay attention to the history, context, and the process of naming, recontextualize names and naming as important tools of decolonization. Names and naming are important in recording of African realities. Name defines us as human. It is a marker of humanity. Names have the power to make manifest. The book shows this in different chapters. I've learned so much from this book about many things. Names, the process of naming, the significance of names, African history, the power of women, and the role of names in identity formation. More important is the realization that I've engaged in some of the activities and practices documented in different chapters of the book without paying attention to them or taking note of the enormity or the significance of my actions. For instance, an incident happened during the naming of my first child. The assistant pastor insisted that I include what he called the Christian name from the Bible. I refused. My argument was that the names in the Bible were Jewish. It took the intervention of the senior pastor who allowed me to have my way. to settle the matter. Reading this book allowed me to understand the gravity of my action, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We just a waste of time. I would like to welcome Hewan Girma on board the session, the author with reader session. So, but without wasting much of our time, I'd like to go to the next present discussant. Olusegun Show-Enta, you have the floor. For 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so in keeping with the tradition of the presenters before me, the title is of this response is Urukoni Roni, name directs one's path. Naming Africans on the epistemic values of names is undoubtedly a great addition to the scholarship of African cultural practices and the feats of onomastic. The authors, Oyeronke and Hewan Girma, shed more light on the nuances surrounding African names, especially regarding their epistemic values. The dedicated scholarly attention to African names provide useful research insights on the nature, composition, and significance of African names in our rapidly modernizing 21st century world. Specifically, in the general introduction, the authors make outstanding claims about African names that distinguish the naming system on the continent and practices that confer names for the sake of object article identification. By scrutinizing Shakespearean musing about name as a signifier of article, which could be being referred to, the author suggests that names in Africa are not mere labels, but an embodiment of what is being referred to and their intricate internal attributes. Thus, the book argues that African names carry significant symbolic meanings beyond their face values, and that they shed more light on history, epistemology, cosmology, liturgy, cultural nuances, and the social science or sciences of African peoples. Thus, the authors claim that African names are archival sources, epistemic, and not merely creative, and I quote now, not merely creative linguistic expressions of the people. This point is critical, at least to me, to the my understanding of the overall reading of the text, in the sense that the expression that names are not just mere creative linguistic expression of the people establishes a fact about African epistemology and the humanization of Africans. Many decades ago, a few European historians, including Hugh Trevor Ropers, claimed that Africans lacked the intellectual capacity to make history and record them. Trevor Ropers posited that, and I quote, Africa had no history prior to European exploration and colonization, and there is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest, he claimed, is darkness. Our past, he claimed, the undefined gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. That is, end of quote, Trevor Roper, 1963, from page 871. By underscoring the historical functionality of some African names, the authors further refute such an egregious claim by scholars like Trevor Roper and allude to the different forms of record-keeping practices African societies had before colonization. Furthermore, the book underscores the preponderances of new names in Africa and thus suggests that, I quote, contemporary African names are instructive indication of Westernization, Christianization, and Islamization, end of quote. The suggestion is apt in the sense that it speaks to and captures the profound impacts of the interwoven tripartite historical events on African epistemologies, including the naming systems. While the author did not provide specific examples here, I wish to cite an example of impacts of Christianization on Yoruba people of Western Nigeria. Osha, God, goddess, is a common feature of many Yoruba names, which indicates the belief of the people in deities. A name such as Oshadamilare, the god goddess has vindicated me, illustrates the belief of the mother parents in the power of the god or goddess to vindicate a barren woman. Possibly may have been erroneously labeled as a witch who killed her fetus in vitro in the coven. The name reflects an act of gratitude However, in contemporary naming convention, Osha, most times it's substituted with Jesus to read Jesu Damilare. In this instance, the article of faith is repositioned and directed to Jesus Christ as a direct affirmation of Christianity. This sudden departure from traditional naming system in modern Yoruba parlance speaks volume about the impact of colonization and foreign religions on African names that the book reiterates. Another major contribution of the book to the African onomastics is the idea that names conceal. It is interesting for me to read the authors mention the fact and the significance of names in concealing identities and hiding historical past. Since names, and I quote them, do not only aid in the construction of identity, but also concretize a people's collective memory by recording the circumstances of their experience, end of quote. It is possible for people to disguise their identities, hide genealogy, and erase historical precedents by changing their names. With family names, for example, cultural DNA tests are possible without the Western laboratory setup. This is because most times individuals are classified, defined, and measured through the lenses of their family names. In that regard, to use my Yoruba culture, not all family names attract goodwill and positive attention. Some family names are synonymous with murder and wickedness. So, since such cultural memory exists, any individual who is associated with a blacklisted family name risks being negatively labeled. So, by adopting new names, individuals can conceal the past and forge a new history. Also, the book makes it clear that adopting a new name could indicate nostalgia and an act of memorialization, as in the case with the author, Novaulette Buluwayo, who changed her name in recognition of her city and also as an act of memorializing her mother. Now, in concealing names, the author's quote, names have strong affective meaning. A person's life history may be written in African cultural names, revealing the circumstances of conception and birth and documenting events in the family history. As such, names are repositories of information with deep-rooted cultural meaning, end of quote. What the authors are saying here is that African names are not just mere labeling of an individual or to signify an article. They have deep-rooted cultural meanings. So for the sake of time, my review did not focus on the entire, on all the chapters in the book, but I focused specifically on a chapter on Yoruba names and Oriki by Oyeronke Oyewumi. Now, here are my notes on the specific section of the book towards a genealogy of gendered names and naming practice. Within the super African naming paradigm, Oyewumi affirms that African names, specifically Yoruba names, do not suggest nor denote a gendered hierarchy. She retraced the gender point she had earlier made in her other publications. However, makes it known that some specific place names, Oriki, are given to the male body types, where some are common among women. This observation, she notes, does not in any way suggest that Yoruba names are gendered. Instead, she claims that the Yoruba naming system, especially in the case of Oriki, may have, and I quote her, may have developed for dissimilar purposes, and they appear not to have the same origin, end of quote. She posits that female Orikis appeared first as a distinct name category. Now, I raised two issues here, or points here. Oyewumi claims that Yoruba Oriki is not gendered, Oyewumi's claim that Yoruba Oriki is not gendered require more scholarly elucidation. Her review of Akinyemi 1993 appears to be incomplete to me. While Akinyemi may not have defined the distinctions between its terms, male, masculine, female, feminine, he made a significant claim that Yoruba names are gendered and simply not interchangeable. While the claim may be contentious, Oyewumi has not provided ample examples from the culture to support her counterclaim. She only mentioned the case of Abefe and Akoki, which are not universal names among the Yorubas. For example, names such as Shogbeson, Shodiya, Shoeton, Shodolamu, Shomefun, and Opaleke are male names among the Egbas, they are never given to female child or female children. So, in the same vein, personal oriki like Alake, Aduke, Akpeke, Akonke, Amofe, and Atoke are female praise names that are never given to any male child. So what does this distinction suggest in terms of gender paradigm among the Yorubas? It is in clearing this distinction that I hope Professor Oyewumi can provide more research evidence to fully unpack a claim that I quote, Akinyemi's argument that certain Yoruba names are feminine because they are female is tautology, end of quote. So conclude my response to this great book. I said in another dimension, while I am fascinated by the richness of solid research work and theoretical paradigms that frame the book, I'm a little disappointed that there's no mentioning of the connection between African names and metaphysics. This singular omission is a huge oversight, in my opinion, as a Yoruba man who understands the metaphysical significance of names. In Yoruba sham-making practices, for example, which I understand very well and which I've written about, name is very important because without it, both animate and non-animate sham objects lose their potency. Thus, name carries a metaphysical connotation beyond its historical, cultural, and social function. Name is so important to the idea of Akunleyon, Anyomo, Kadara, Orire, and Oriburuku, destiny, primordial weight, good luck, and bad luck. There is an assumption that says, Orukomo ni Ruomo in Yoruba, Asomle, Okwalawole, Asomo ni Shode, Ode, Asomo ni Sorinlo, Orinlo. A name directs a child that you name a child Kolawole, it brings wealth to the house. You name a child Shode, one that comes, it returns. And you name a child Sorinlo, the one that, perishes away and, is marooned. Why understand that putting a rich text at this volume together on African name practice is an Herculean task. Yet, I will appreciate the comments of the authors regarding this observation about names and metaphysics in Africa. Thank you for putting this great work together, and I appreciate your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful contribution there. I think I will take some comments from before I return to the authors. I would like to ask the audience. We have a few comments. I'll take the comments, then I will return to the authors, Professor Oyeronke and Girma, for their reaction. So the audience, if you have comments or contribution, so that our case will not be like that of a boy who is accused of, there's a case of a young man in UK, it's just a fable, that is suspected to have stolen something or done something bad. So one of the Yoruba man there was asking for his full name, and he said his name is Omochetan, Omorile, and the meaning is the child has corrected the artwork and has returned home. So at the end of the day, there's no need to look at what has happened. The intention is not have an issue because he wrote his name when he wanted to enter the store as Omochetan, Omorile. So I think there's a lot to names, I presume, and I want to agree with the author. But the audience, you have the floor, please. Anybody? Yes, Prof.
I have to confess that I haven't read the book. Oh, Mojuba Olu Olufunke Okome. My name is full of history and the specifics of my birth, especially within the context of my parents' experience. And the same goes for my siblings. And so this is a great book, but I want to see the discourse on naming as a beginning that needs to be fleshed out. I think the issue of the gendering also has to be better explicated, because I don't think one could say that there's one answer to the question, are Yoruba names gendered? Some of them are not. And I actually provoked people by naming my second child. I have two, Oluwafeyikemi. And I named him after my grandmother, whom I never met, but she was a very important person. When people hear that, they'll say Kemi is a female name, but there is nothing about Kemi that says that only females should have that name. And so I am not shy of explaining to many confused Yoruba people how non-gendered Kemi is. And you find that there are many such examples. Fumilayo, you'll find some males and females bearing it, although majority of people who have the name are women. So we took on a lot of the practices of our colonizers without, because we are, I guess our minds have been colonized, plus we think that westernization is equal to modernity and that we want to be civilized, which is another term that I really have objection to. So this book is a great contribution. I think I have to wrap up because it's not my panel and whatever, but naming is very important. And I think many of us should be more mindful when we are naming our children, and also, oro. Words are important and we should choose our words carefully. I tell my white colleagues, when you're talking to me, choose your words carefully. And if you don't, you are going to bear my wrath and I'll win that argument, So it's important for us to be mindful. It's important for us to value what we have. We tend to forget and we tend to be too eager to embrace things that are not ours, that have no meaning. Created by people who don't like us, the people who said we don't have history. And by the way, that Trevor, whoever's statement came from Hegel, or whatever his name is, earlier. He was the first one to say we had no history. And we should know that there's a politics to these namings, to the words we use, and to the identities that we bear.
Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you. Round of applause, please. Thank you. Yes, I'll take two more. Yes, please.
All right. Good day, everyone. My name is I'm Nkechi Mbodichimma Ukebu. I usually like saying this because I do not have an English name. And we have a long history in our family that my parents give us all Igbo names and no English names. I'm a linguist, and I've been recently very interested in indigenous knowledge systems. In fact, I have a work I'm doing on naming practices for now in Birom, because Birom was a language I worked on as my PhD thesis. Now, there was something I observed, because I really want to thank all of you for the new perspectives I got from today's panel, because I was looking at something that works in Birom. I like the idea that Professor Sherrington brought in, the idea of linking namings to metaphysical world. Now, in the Birom, in their in their understanding about how they name people, their naming practices, what they do is that they have ways. Okay, mostly you hear a lot of them bear names that are animal names. I was trying to look at conceptualizing faunal metaphors, that's animal metaphors, in the naming practice they have. Okay, so, but I observed that beyond just the naming, sometimes they use physical attributes of people that are given birth to when they are born to liken it. If it has some kind of attributes of animals, they name them based on the animals. If you're hairy, you're like a gorilla. They name you a gorilla. If you have big eyes and small head and you don't grow tall, they name you a snake. They have big-eyed people, frog. They name that. But one of the things that is very important I observed from their naming practice, yes, is the idea that they see human beings as an extension of the natural world. And then that has to do with ecology, because what happens is that they said there's a quote system they have that a human being has an alter ego in the wild, and that it makes them now, you don't hunt specific animals because of that reason. So I feel that perspective is also very important in naming practices. Thank you.
It won't be up to 2 minutes. Okay, hello. Hi, Professor Oyewumi. Thank you so much. I've read a lot of our work, though I've not read this, but I'm so much of a student of yours. So I just want to make a slight comment. My name is Faithful. I have English name. And although, so I had to change that many people call me Oluwabukumi or Abeni. So I just want to make a comment on gendered names. So I think there's also, I have this thought that there's also a first person principle that makes some names gendered. Now she said her son's name is Oluwafe, and people around him, so I had a student, when I was doing my undergraduate, she was a junior student, and her elder sister's name is Oluwafemi, that's Olufemi. When she told me her sister's name is Femi, so they called the girl Femi. When she told me her sister's name is Femi, I said, that's a guy's name. But she was like, no, it's when she was surprised when she saw guys bearing Femi, because she grew up knowing her sister as Olufemi. So someone that grows up so I think there's a first person principle around naming more than even gender, because I've met more guys bearing Bukumi than me. And then my siblings, I say, why are you bearing a girl's name? They say, no, you're the one bearing a guy's name. But so that's just my thought. You want any more? Yeah. That's a minute.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, please. And after that,
The observation of the last discussion. Okay. Philomena Egbe from Philosophy Department. So what the last discussed, a point he made concerning concerning the metaphysical aspect, that the book he reviewed, there's a missing point there concerning the metaphysical metaphysical aspect.
Can you hear? Can you hear?
Can you hear
Yes.
her?
Straight on, can you hear?
You're muted.
You're mute, straight on.
I can hear her loud and clear. Thank you.
So I agree with.
Can hear, right?
Yeah.
Okay, what I just want to say is that I agree with him. That observation is very, very important. So if that aspect, that's the metaphysical aspect of naming, is left out, it's a big gap. Because
people have Oriki without metaphysics.
Exactly.
I will not allow
Okay, so that's the point I just want to make, that it's a big gap and it needs to be filled. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, my name is Olufunke Awodia, and I've not read this book. I think I'm challenged to read this book. And while that discussion was going on, when they were talking about gender, something came to my mind that there's a Yoruba, I don't know if it's a saying or proverb that says, Tí ò bá nídìí, obìnrin ò kì í jẹ́ molu. So I was wondering, it means that maybe some names are gender specific for real in the Yoruba culture. And secondly, before I drop this mic, my name and my background brought some things to my mind again. I was named Funke, and I have an older cousin who is 70 years old, who is Funke, but she has another name, Taiwo. And from one side of my family, they don't call me Funke because they believe that it's an insult to call mommy Tokunbo or big mommy or whatever we call her Funke, why Funke is in the house. So they gave me another name. They call me Bolanle anytime I'm around there. So I'm wondering, is there a politics around naming and identities? So thank you very much.
Question, please. Sorry, I know you all.
Thank you so much. Quite interesting book. I wish to lay my hands on it and read. I have a kind of question. I don't know. Abiola Yodoku. Yeah. So I'd like to, I don't know if it's a question or a comment. Let me start with this. I named my daughter Oyeronke Sharon Evelyn. And she went to school and she renamed herself. And she keeps telling people, my name is Anike. I said, what's your English name? Anike. What about Sharon? No, I don't want Sharon. Call me Anike. And the question is, sorry, I don't know what the book is all about, but I just want to know, is there any perspective of renaming, like the Yoruba renaming, like my daughter that renamed herself Anike and went to her school to tell people, she is Anike, don't call me Sharon, call me Anike. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah. My name is Isoke Noye. Yes. And then I want to buttress what you're saying, because when I listen to all this, and my question is, who has the right to name a child? The child or the parents?
Okay. So we need to go back to the authors. Professor Oyeronke Oyewumi and Professor Hewan Girma. I know you are ready for us. Sure, you have the floor now.
Hewan Girma will go first. Hi, Hewan.
Hewan Girma, you have the floor for 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Loud and clear.
Hello.
Perfect. Thank you, and I apologize for the internet connection issues that I had at the beginning. I am currently in Addis, in Ethiopia, and internet tends to go in and out at times, so I apologize for that. I am really delighted to join you today to be able to discuss this book, and this amazing discussion that came out of it is just it gives me a lot of food for thought. Maybe down the line we'll have to think about like a second edition of this book or a second volume. I got into names as a result of Professor Oyewumi, and I want to say thank you for that, because this is something that I took for granted. Names is something that we all have and don't necessarily think about, or at least for me, until I was prompted to do so. So this has been a very fruitful area of research for me. And I know there's a lot of questions and a lot of comments. The one thing that I want to address using Ethiopian societies, Amharic-speaking societies in Ethiopia in particular, is the question around metaphysics in African names, which I think is a very fascinating area to engage in. Using my father's name as an example, Girma, which means majesty. It's like it's a way to raise up someone. He was born in a very poor family, and he was given this type of name to kind of predict or to kind of bring to life a future for him that he might not have been born into. And this was a very common practice during his time period, and it still continues even now. So there's a lot of names that points to, you know, this is the type of future that I want to have for my child. And so he was given the name Majesty. And I also want to bring up the question of gender, because my grandma has lost a couple of boys before his birth. And then when he was born, the way to kind of shield him from the evil eye, or, you know, however way they wanted to think about it, was to give him a name that predicts a very positive future, but also to feminize that name. So officially his name is Girma, but unofficially within the family he was called like a feminine version of that name, so Girmish. So this was to fool the devil, the evil eye, or whatever, to kind of make him seem like this was a girl that was kind of in hiding. So this was a practice that he grew up with, and it was only after my birth that his family, his mom, his sisters, etc., stopped calling him the feminine version of his name, because at that point he was in his 30s, so he has survived that childhood, the evil eye that would get him as a boy, because my grandma had a lot of surviving girls but no boys, and so he ended up being the only boy. So the whole gender and the metaphysics in this instance, I think, is a very fascinating way to look into this. The question around renaming, this is one of the things that fascinates me, especially as someone who lives in the diaspora, living in the US, and thinking about how our names are mispronounced. They are not fully understood, and we're asked to have like an English name or like a Western type of name. A lot of us do resist that question that we get from a lot of places, and asking for respect for our names, right? So one of the populations that I've been studying lately is Ethiopian adoptees that have been adopted outside of the country into different Western societies, the US, Canada, different European nations. And one of the practices that's very common at that point is that their names, the original Ethiopian names, are changed into either an American, a Canadian, a French, whatever society they end up in, a name from that society. And a lot of the adoptees, once they grow up, they resist this practice and demand to be called by their original Ethiopian name because names, African names, are very, very powerful. So there is a big tendency to take away African names, to not value them in the West. And I talk about the West because that's where I currently live. So there's a lot to be said in terms of who has, what names are respected and what names are not. And also the last question about who has the right to name a child. One of the things that I'm noticing with the adoptees is that once they get to an age where they are able to name themselves, then they go back to a name that they choose, either a name that was chosen by their birth families or a name that they choose themselves that ties them more to their Ethiopian identity and African origins. So I'll pause here and I'll let Professor Oyewumi continue.
Thank you so much, Girma. Professor Oyeronke, orúkọ tó bá wa mọ ní jẹ́ lẹ́yìn odi o. A child can choose a name.
Oyeronke mo ń jẹ́ nílé àti lóko. Anyway, thank you so much for putting our book on the agenda. And I like the fact that it has provoked so much thought and so many questions. I appreciate that very much. The time is short, but let me be very pointed and start by putting Shueton on the spot. I thought, Shegun, that you were a fan of Oyewumi. But from your presentation, I'm not quarreling with your findings of anything. What I found is that you have not read Oyewumi. And I thought that you would have read all of it. What I'm saying here is that the chapter you have in Naming Africans is just a fragment of my work on naming. In my book, What Gender is Motherhood, that it came from, there are 3 chapters on naming. And the one you read is just introduction. And in your case, I thought you would have gone further and said, what else did she say? So all your questions on metaphysics, on gender, all the questions that people have asked are all in these chapters. So about 60 pages of this book is on naming, and I attend to all those questions. There's no way you can talk about Yoruba names without talking about metaphysics. What are Amutorua names? There's no way you can do that. And then on the question of gender, that led me to the naming process itself. I examined all kinds of issues, some of which some of you are raising. And let me draw attention to what is it Faith? Yeah. Faith, or one of the commenters talked about growing up with a particular name for her sister, and then finding out in other places it's for men. In my family, for example, we have male Femi. We have male Femi. Yes. Yeah. In my family, we have male Femi, female Femi. I have 26 siblings. We have male Bukola, all sorts of names. And I think the point that commenter made, I made in my book, she makes it so well when she called it first principle. I didn't call it first principle. I said the
first person principle.
Yes. I said the question of whether one Yoruba name is gendered or not has to do with spatial and temporal difference. If you say that, oh, in my family, only males are Femi, believe me, if you went 200 miles later, you will be shocked to find that in other families, only females are Femi. So there's that spatial issue and there's temporal. And I think part of that temporal is quite interesting. And for scholars of Yoruba, Samuel Johnson, when you look at historical names that people were giving each other, names are shifting, names are changing. And you'll be surprised to find that a particular name 200 years ago was associated with this kind of thing. So, Shweton, you have to look at that. I covered all those things in various chapters and various angles that I look at in this book. The reason why I started looking at names in the first place is quite interesting. After my original work on the fact that Yoruba institutions and social practices and names are not gender specific, I was hoping that somebody would call me to attention. Perhaps Shweton should have then that, but Professor, what about Oriki? And so in my next book, I set out to investigate Oriki names. And when I say Oriki names, I'm using that because I'm talking of the personal names. Not all Yorubas have Oriki, but we or yours have it. So I set out with the question, to gender or not to gender Oriki. That was how I started. And I thought it was going to take 5 pages. But lo, it took 60 pages. And by the end of it, I came to the conclusion that Oriki are not gender specific. And I lay on a lot of the arguments. You will need to look at those other chapters, especially if you're working on it. But what is also interesting to me is that I preempted Ashake. I hope you all know Ashake. Who took his mother's, they said he took his mother's Oriki.
Yes.
But Ashake was right on it. And I address this in my book, in various chapters in my book, when I said that the so-called female Oriki, Anike, Ashake, my Oriki is Anike, and I believe Professor Juba Olus, Oriki too is Anike, so we can speak about the daughter. My Oriki is Anike, Ashake, Alake, Akmike. One of the things that immediately become apparent as I did the research on so-called female names is that when you hear Akmike, Alake, these names are actually one name. They mean the same thing, that a child should be cherished, a child should be loved. That's what these names mean. And it's so striking. And as I continued with my research, I discovered that these names historically emerged out of Ekun Yawo, which Shweton will appreciate. And these are names that female brides gave themselves. That's why they're such positive names. Akike want to be held and loved. Alake, Ashake want to be chosen and loved. And I came to the conclusion that these names are so beautiful. Why wouldn't a male child want the name? Why wouldn't mothers want to give their males, even their males, that name? And that's what Ashake proved, because these are beautiful names. They are not gender specific. Whether it's male or female, you want to be loved, you want the child to be loved. And I think that it's so important. This so-called female, beautiful terms of endearment of Yoruba names are important, even more so in the context of the world in which you hear that, oh, people don't neglect female children. In some places, female children are killed and all that. In Yoruba, these are wonderful terms of endearment that the males are even jealous of. That's why Ashake chose it. So I am saying that in the first instance, you see, I'm a gender scholar. So some of the questions I asked, in fact, the very first question, what makes something gendered? Why is it gendered? What is the meaning of gender? And as I continue to investigate these names, I came to the conclusion from evidence that the so-called female Oriki are a totally different set of names than the so-called male Oriki. It is often when things are coupled, that's where gender comes in. And I'm saying that in the origins of these names, they originated differently and they were not coupled. The female names came first. When you look at the so-called main name, Ayinla, Ajani, and so on, the male names are not uniform like the female names. And the male names, the meanings don't roll off the tongue like the female names. So I believe that these are two different sets of names, and that with the gendering that came with modernity, with Christian names, with Muslim names, gender crept into how we're looking at them. That in the first instance, they were not gender. All those arguments are in this book. Okay, I couldn't include my 3 chapters in a book that I was editing. I only included 1 chapter. Finally, for the woman who named her child, I don't know why you are giving your child Sharon, it's your right in Nigeria, but your daughter is already correcting you, and she's chosen the beautiful Anike, one that is good to have and cherish. But the final thing I'm going to say, with the choosing of Anike as a name, and something I examined here, and I did present actually at maybe the 5th edition of Lagos Studies Association, amongst the Oyo Yorubas who bear Oriki name, Oriki are not everyday names. They are special names. They are terms of endearment. And they are used to make you feel good, to feel puffed up and everything. And that is why I believe that they are not everyday, they could be everyday names, but they are not every time names. Because if you use your Oriki as your first name, it loses that special meaning of puffing you up when you do something good. And that is why Oyo people always say about Lagosians, àwọn ará Èkó don't foriki joruko. They are always surprised because when you use your Oriki as your first name, it loses that special term of endearment. You see how you might be calling your husband darling, darling, honey, every minute. When you say it, it's lost its meaning. So if you are using darling as his first name, please find something else. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Round of applause, please. Shweta, I'm saying hello to you, Shweta. You want to say something? You want to say something?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Prof has spoken, but first let me contextualize this. So my comments are made in regards to the book in revision that we are reviewing. So that does not attest to the fact that I've not read other works by Professor. So you know, I'm one of his I teach his courses in my I use his books in my classes.
Our books.
But because our books rather. But because of the fact that
it's non-gendered pronoun.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
good.
yeah. So I use some of our books in my classes. But the fact remains that here we are talking about naming, and that this is a book in review that we are responding to. So not our entire collections. And that is, yeah, so that's my observation about that book.
Yes.
And I think if we are to stay in the context of this one book, so if other chapters on those points could be added, that would be a great addition to some people who may not have, the opportunity to read other works.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Brother, no, Brother,
okay. You want to give him the last word?
No problem. You have the floor. 2 minutes.
No, I only want to say that I was not saying people should read all my books. You were talking about gaps in argument. There's no way anybody can talk about Yoruba names without metaphysics. Okay? So you were talking about gaps in argument, not the particular book. Let's just leave it at that.
Okay, there's another response here.
Well, I mean, again, this is not a response as such. It's just a comment. I think I would have to email you because I have, not just questions. I mean, for this, but some questions. I'm working on something that I'll require to discuss with you, please. So I will email you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, ma. Thank you, Professor Oyeronke Oyewumi. Professor Hewan, Girma, thank you so much. That is to the authors. But to discussants, special thank you for joining us on this special panel. And also the attendees, we appreciate you. From all of us here, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you. Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Oh, my. We can leave.